Brigadier General Samuel Carter had spent over 30 years serving his country, leading soldiers through some of the most dangerous conflicts in modern history. He had fought in war zones, made life-or-death decisions, and seen things most men would never understand. Though he had survived countless battles, he never imagined that one of his most chilling encounters would happen on a quiet city road, far from any battlefield. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. So you won't miss out on more thrilling stories. Drop a comment below with your thoughts and share this story with those who need to hear it. Turn on the notification bell to stay updated with our latest videos. See you in the next exciting and meaningful story. At 62 years old, Samuel had retired with honor and distinction, receiving numerous medals for bravery and leadership. Despite his decorated career, he lived a simple, solitary life. With no family of his own, his existence was defined by discipline, routine, and a deep connection to his past. His home was filled with photographs of fallen comrades, their faces forever frozen in time, a reminder of the price of service. That evening, Governor Richard Lawson personally called him with an invitation. "Samuel, it's been too long," Lawson said in a warm tone. "I'd like to invite you over for dinner. My family and I have the deepest respect for what you've done for this country, and I want to show my appreciation." Samuel hesitated for a moment. It wasn't often that he attended social events, but something about the governor's voice felt genuine. Perhaps for one night he could step away from the weight of his past. "I'd be honored, Richard," he finally replied. As he prepared for the evening, an unnerving chill crept through his house. The temperature had dropped inexplicably, and for a brief second he thought he heard a whisper, a faint, distant voice echoing from the hallway. He turned sharply, scanning the dimly lit space, but there was nothing. The air felt thick, heavy, as if the walls were closing in. Samuel took a deep breath, shaking it off. "You're imagining things," he muttered under his breath, convincing himself that the ghosts of his past were just memories, nothing more. He selected a simple yet dignified suit, one that spoke of his humility rather than his rank. Before leaving, he carefully wrapped a small but symbolic gift, a bronze eagle statuette, a timeless representation of freedom, courage, and honor. It was meant as a gesture of gratitude, a reminder of the values he had sworn to protect. Driving through the city, he noticed how unnaturally quiet the streets were. The usual hum of traffic was absent, replaced by an eerie stillness that sent a strange sense of unease creeping up his spine. The streetlights flickered, casting long, unnatural shadows that seemed to stretch toward his car. As he neared the governor's residence, his radio suddenly crackled with static. For a brief moment, he heard something, a whisper, but it wasn't a transmission. The words were distorted, inhuman, like multiple voices speaking at once. "Turn back." Samuel's breath hitched. He turned the volume down, but the whispers persisted. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the radio went silent. Something wasn't right. His instincts, honed through years of war, screamed at him to be on high alert. He checked his rear-view mirror, scanning the dark streets behind him. That's when he saw it. The headlights of a police car suddenly appearing behind him, flashing red and blue. There had been no car there moments ago. It had come out of nowhere. Samuel gripped the wheel tighter, his heartbeat steady but focused. This wasn't just an ordinary stop. Something was wrong. Very wrong. Samuel Carter had been in dangerous situations before. He had faced enemies in the heat of battle, navigated ambushes, and walked through fields riddled with landmines. But as the red and blue lights flashed in his rearview mirror, a different kind of unease gripped him, a feeling that this was no ordinary traffic stop. His hands stayed steady on the wheel, but his instincts screamed at him. Something was off. There had been no sign of a police car before, no headlights approaching, no engine noise. Yet now, out of absolute darkness, one had materialized right behind him. Samuel pulled over, his military discipline keeping him calm, but his heartbeat remained heavy in his chest. The street was eerily quiet, save for the rhythmic flash of the patrol car's lights. The moment he parked, his radio crackled again, emitting an unnatural static. Faintly, just beneath the distortion, he heard it. A voice, cold and hollow, whispering words he couldn't quite understand. He took a deep breath, his muscles tightening. This wasn't normal. Then came the slow, deliberate footsteps. The sound echoed unnaturally in the empty night as the officer approached his vehicle. When Samuel glanced into his side mirror, his stomach dropped. The man walking toward him looked like a cop, but something about him was wrong. His uniform was worn and slightly outdated, as if it belonged to another time. His skin was pale, almost grey, and his eyes, they were empty, devoid of any real life. For a split second, Samuel thought he saw something unnatural in the reflection of the glass, like the officer's face didn't quite belong to his body. A deep, guttural voice cut through the silence. "License and registration." The words weren't shouted, nor were they spoken in the usual commanding tone of an officer. They were flat, emotionless, unnatural, as if they had been rehearsed too many times. Samuel rolled down his window just a crack, keeping his composure. "Is there a problem, officer?" His voice was calm, but his senses were razor-sharp. The officer, Officer Brian Henderson, according to his badge, didn't blink. He simply stared, his expression unreadable. Then, in a voice just barely above a whisper, he repeated, "License and registration." Samuel frowned. Something wasn't right. He had been in law enforcement long enough to recognize protocol, and this wasn't it. There was no reason for this stop. No approach, no proper procedure, just a demand, like a command from something that wasn't fully human. "I don't believe I violated any traffic laws," Samuel responded, keeping his tone measured. "May I ask why I'm being stopped?" For the first time, Officer Henderson's expression shifted. His lips curled into a slow, unsettling smirk, one that sent a chill through Samuel's bones. "This is my road." The words sent a jolt of unease down Samuel's spine. The streetlights around them flickered, casting long, unnatural shadows that twisted and moved as if they had a life of their own. The air grew heavy, thick with something Samuel could only describe as wrong. He had felt danger before, but this was something else entirely. Keeping his movements controlled, Samuel reached for his phone. If this officer wasn't real, if this was something else, he needed backup. He needed to call Governor Lawson before things got worse. But the moment his fingers touched the screen, the car's electronics went haywire. The radio blasted distorted voices, the dashboard flickered as if the power was surging uncontrollably, and for a brief second, the GPS screen displayed a message that made his blood run cold. "You shouldn't be here." Before he could react, the officer suddenly slammed his fist against the car window, hard enough to make the glass vibrate. Samuel's pulse quickened, but he kept his face unreadable. "Step out of the car." The demand was clear, but Samuel knew better than to follow orders from something he didn't fully understand. Something unnatural was at play here, and he was trapped right in the middle of it. Samuel Carter had faced ambushes in war zones, but this? This was different. It wasn't just the flickering streetlights, the eerie quiet, or the strange coldness seeping into his bones. It was the officer himself. There was something wrong about Officer Brian Henderson. His uniform was crisp, but felt out of place, like something from a different decade. His movements were too precise, too calculated, like a puppet mimicking human behavior. And his eyes, they were hollow, black, depthless voids that seemed to swallow the night. Samuel's instinct screamed at him. This was no ordinary man. "Step out of the car," Henderson repeated, his voice a mix of static and whispers, as if multiple voices were speaking in unison. Samuel gripped the steering wheel tighter, his military discipline keeping his pulse steady. If this was a threat, he had to assess it first. "Officer, I have done nothing wrong," he said carefully. "If there's an issue, I'd like to contact my attorney or a superior officer." For a brief moment, Henderson didn't move. Then his lips twitched into a slow, unsettling grin. "There's no one to call, General." Samuel's stomach dropped. He hadn't said his rank. He hadn't mentioned his past. Yet this officer knew exactly who he was. Something was very, very wrong. The car's radio crackled violently, filling the cabin with distorted whispers, screams, and something that sounded like sobbing. The GPS screen glowed unnaturally bright before flashing two words that sent a chill through Samuel's spine: "Turn back." Suddenly, a blast of cold air rushed into the car, except the windows were closed. Samuel could feel something unseen, something moving inside with him, just beyond the edge of his vision. That's when he noticed it. In the side mirror, Officer Henderson's reflection wasn't there. Samuel's breath hitched, but his hands remained steady. His mind raced. Was this real? A trick of the light? A hallucination? No, this was something else. Something dark. Last chance, Henderson murmured, his voice deeper now, inhuman. Step out, or I'll pull you out. Samuel had no intention of obeying. Instead, he reached for his phone, his fingers brushing the screen to dial Governor Lawson. But before he could press call, the car's electronics shorted out completely. The screen glitched, flashing images of warped faces, burned bodies, and something monstrous staring back at him from the darkness. Then, a loud, deafening bang. The car shook violently as Henderson slammed his fist against the hood, his strength unnatural. The impact left a deep dent in the metal, something no human should be able to do. Samuel forced himself to stay calm. If this was an enemy, he had to stay rational. Fear would get him killed. I don't know what you are, Samuel said slowly, keeping his voice controlled, but I know you're not a cop. For the first time, Henderson's expression shifted. The grin faded. The thing wearing the officer's face tilted its head slightly, as if considering Samuel's words. Then the streetlights exploded all at once. Shards of glass rained down, the road was plunged into total darkness, and in that moment Samuel saw it, the true form hidden beneath the disguise. It was still wearing the uniform, still standing in the same place. But now it was wrong. Its limbs were too long, its jaw unhinged too wide, and its eyes burned with something unholy. It leaned forward, its whispering voice surrounding Samuel from every direction. You shouldn't be here, General. Samuel clenched his jaw, his fingers tightening into fists. If this thing wanted him afraid, it had picked the wrong soldier. In the distance, he heard something. A car approaching. Help was coming. But would it arrive before this thing decided to drag him into whatever darkness it came from? The darkness around Samuel Carter felt alive. The air was thick, suffocating, as if something unseen was pressing against his chest, waiting for him to break. Officer Henderson, or whatever had taken his form, stood motionless, its black, hollow eyes fixed on him. Samuel could hear the distant hum of an approaching vehicle. Help was coming. But would it arrive in time? His military instincts kicked in. Assess, adapt, act. He had faced threats before, enemies with weapons, ambushes in hostile territories, but never anything like this. A sudden shift in the atmosphere sent a shiver down his spine. Henderson's unnatural grin widened, stretching beyond what should be physically possible. They can't save you, General, the thing whispered. The car's radio burst into static again, voices layered over one another, some crying, some screaming, others muttering unintelligible words in distorted, otherworldly tones. Samuel refused to let fear take hold. He reached for the door handle, prepared to step out and face whatever this was head-on. If this thing wanted to test him, it would find out exactly what kind of man it was dealing with. Just as he moved, the street was suddenly flooded with light. A large black SUV screeched to a stop behind them, its headlights slicing through the unnatural darkness like a blade. Governor Richard Lawson stepped out, his face set in a mask of determination. But it was Chief Andrew Mitchell, the city's top law enforcement officer, who drew his weapon immediately, his sharp eyes scanning the situation. "Officer Henderson," Mitchell barked, "step away from the vehicle." For a moment, everything froze. The world seemed to hold its breath. Then slowly, unnervingly slowly, Henderson turned his head toward them. But he didn't move like a man. His body shifted in a jerking, unnatural motion, like a puppet being forced to perform. "That's not Henderson," Samuel called out, his voice firm, steady. Mitchell's expression darkened. "What the hell are you talking about?" "Henderson is dead," Governor Lawson said grimly. "He died 5 years ago." A chilling silence fell over them. The wind howled through the empty street, carrying something with it, a faint, agonized whisper that didn't come from any of them. Mitchell's grip on his gun tightened. "This isn't possible." The thing wearing Henderson's face began to twitch, its features distorting, unraveling. Then it lunged forward. Samuel reacted instantly, yanking the door open and rolling out of the car just as Henderson's hand smashed through the glass, sending shards flying. The monster let out a horrific, inhuman screech, its voice warping as its form flickered between human and something far, far worse. Mitchell fired. The gunshot echoed, but it didn't hit flesh. Instead, the bullet passed through Henderson's body like it wasn't even there. The thing turned its head sharply toward Mitchell, its mouth twisting into something that barely resembled a human expression. "You can't stop me," it whispered, its voice a chorus of the dead. Then the streetlights exploded again, casting everything into total darkness. For a long, terrible moment, there was nothing but silence. Then Henderson was gone. The air around them lightened, but an eerie, lingering presence remained. Samuel got to his feet, dusting off the shards of broken glass from his sleeve, his expression unreadable. Mitchell's hands were shaking slightly as he lowered his gun. "What the hell was that?" Governor Lawson exhaled, his jaw clenched. "A ghost," he said simply. "A vengeful one." Samuel looked around, scanning the street with his trained eyes. It was over, for now. But deep down, he knew this was far from finished. Whatever had come after him wasn't done yet. The air was still thick with tension, the weight of the encounter lingering like a shadow over the street. Samuel Carter steadied himself, his soldiers' discipline keeping his breathing measured, but he could feel it. The presence hadn't completely left. Governor Richard Lawson and Chief Andrew Mitchell exchanged wary glances, their minds struggling to rationalize what had just happened. Henderson, or the thing that had taken his form, had vanished, but the streetlights still flickered, and a deep, unnatural chill remained in the air. "That wasn't human," Mitchell muttered, rubbing the back of his neck, his voice barely above a whisper. Samuel turned to him, his face grim. "No, it wasn't." Lawson took a slow step forward, scanning the shattered glass on the ground. His usually composed demeanor was shaken. "Henderson is dead," he said, more to himself than anyone else. "But whatever that was, it knew us. It knew everything." Samuel clenched his jaw. The thing had called him general, had known his history, his past. It wasn't just a wandering spirit. It had purpose. Then, from down the street, the sound of a car door opening and closing snapped their attention forward. A man, a local news reporter, camera in hand, stepped cautiously toward them. I saw everything," he stammered. His face was pale, his hands visibly shaking. "I was across the street filming for a different story, but then I saw—" Samuel locked eyes with him. The man looked terrified. "You filmed it?" Mitchell asked, his voice sharp. The reporter hesitated, then nodded slowly. It didn't look real," he whispered. "That thing, it wasn't human, was it?" Lawson exhaled, running a hand down his face. "We need to see the footage." The reporter pulled up the video on his phone. As they all huddled around the screen, Samuel felt his stomach tighten. The footage showed everything. The stop, Henderson's unnatural movements, the exploding streetlights, the moment he flickered into something inhuman. But the final few seconds were what made the hair on Samuel's arm stand on end. As the camera zoomed in on Henderson's distorted face, a low, guttural whisper bled through the audio. "I'm not the only one." Then, just before Henderson vanished into the darkness, something appeared behind him in the shadows. Not one figure, not two. Dozens. Figures standing in the blackness, just out of reach of the light, watching. Waiting. The reporter snapped the phone shut, his face drained of all color. I don't know what that means, but I swear I didn't edit this. This is real." A heavy silence fell over the group. Samuel exhaled, his voice steady. "It means this isn't over." Mitchell looked around the street, his unease deepening. If Henderson wasn't alone, then what the hell are we dealing with? No one answered. The night felt colder than before, and even though Henderson was gone, Samuel couldn't shake the feeling that something else was watching them from the darkness. The video of the haunting encounter spread like wildfire. Within hours, news outlets picked up the story, and social media erupted with speculation, fear, and disbelief. Some dismissed it as an elaborate hoax, while others, including paranormal researchers, claimed it was undeniable proof of something beyond human understanding. But for Brigadier General Samuel Carter, Governor Richard Lawson, and Chief Andrew Mitchell, this wasn't just a story for the public to consume, it was a warning. The shadows weren't gone. Inside the governor's office, the atmosphere was heavy. The lights in the room felt dimmer than usual, casting long, unnatural shadows that Samuel couldn't ignore. It was as if something had followed them back from that night, lurking just beyond sight. Mitchell paced the floor, arms crossed, his face set in deep frustration. "I've been a cop for over 20 years, he muttered, shaking his head. "I've dealt with murderers, liars, con artists, but never anything like this." Lawson exhaled, rubbing his temples. "The public is demanding answers. They're calling for police reform, for transparency. But what the hell are we supposed to tell them?" Samuel sat in silence for a long moment, his fingers tapping against the wooden desk. Finally he spoke. "We tell them the truth." The room fell silent. Mitchell scoffed. "And what truth is that, General?" "That a dead officer crawled out of hell and tried to drag you with him." Samuel met his gaze. "That there are things in this world we don't understand, and that corruption, whether it's in life or in death, always comes back for justice." Lawson leaned back in his chair, considering the weight of those words. The public already suspects something supernatural. Even with all the skeptics, the footage is out there. People are scared. Samuel nodded. "Then we use that fear to make sure this never happens again." A plan was put into motion. The police department initiated immediate reform, ensuring that no officer would ever again hold unchecked power the way Henderson once did. Training programs were launched, focusing on ethical enforcement, de-escalation tactics, and civilian protection. It was damage control for some, but for Samuel it was a necessary step toward justice. But even as the city moved forward, Samuel couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that something wasn't right. One evening, after leaving a community meeting, he felt it again. That same oppressive chill that had wrapped around him the night of the stop. He paused on the sidewalk, the streetlights flickering above him. Then he heard it. A whisper, low, distorted, familiar. "I'm not the only one." Samuel's breath hitched, his hands instinctively balled into fists, and he slowly turned. The street was empty, but just beyond the glow of the street lamp, in the deepest part of the shadows, he could see movement. Not one figure, not two. Dozens. Silent, watching, waiting. Samuel stood his ground, his heartbeat steady despite the icy dread creeping up his spine. He wasn't afraid, not of ghosts, not of the unknown. If the past had come back for justice, he would be ready. This wasn't over. Samuel Carter had spent his life facing enemies on the battlefield, but this was different. There were no war plans, no tactics to outmaneuver. This wasn't a fight against an enemy of flesh and blood. This was something older, something unseen, something that refused to rest. The city had moved on, or at least it pretended to. News coverage of the supernatural incident faded, buried beneath the latest headlines. The footage of Officer Henderson's ghostly manifestation was still out there, still dissected by paranormal enthusiasts and skeptics alike. But for most, it was just another strange story lost to time. But Samuel knew better. It wasn't over. He felt it in the way the streetlights flickered as he passed by, in the way the shadows seemed deeper than before. He felt it in the moments of silence, in the stillness that was too unnatural, like the world itself was holding its breath. And then there were the whispers. At first, they came in the dead of night, just as Samuel drifted to sleep. A low, crackling voice, like a radio stuck between stations. The words were indistinct, murmuring just at the edge of understanding, but soon they grew clearer. "You think this is over?" The voice wasn't just Henderson's anymore, there were others. One night, Samuel sat alone in his study, reviewing old military reports, trying to distract himself. The room was dim, the desk lamp casting long, warped shadows on the walls. Then a breath of cold air brushed the back of his neck. He turned sharply. No one was there. But his computer screen glitched, the text on his report distorting into a single phrase, repeated over and over, "I'm not the only one." Samuel slowly leaned back in his chair, exhaling through his nose. He had faced things far worse than fear itself. This wouldn't shake him. But it did confirm what he already knew. The dead weren't finished with him. The next morning, he met with Governor Lawson and Chief Mitchell over breakfast. Their expressions were weary, their eyes heavy from sleepless nights. "You've been hearing them too, haven't you?" Samuel asked, breaking the silence. Mitchell looked up sharply, his grip tightening on his coffee cup. "I thought I was losing my damn mind." Lawson ran a hand through his graying hair. "They're still here, Samuel." Samuel nodded. "Then we have unfinished business." There was no final victory against something like this. No battle that could be won with strategy alone. But one thing was clear, the spirits weren't just haunting them, they were watching, waiting for something more. And Samuel knew one truth better than any man. The past never stays buried. If the dead demanded justice, he would be there to face them, not as a soldier, not as a hero, but as a man who wasn't afraid to walk into the darkness and demand answers.